One thing I think needs to be acknowledged is the fact that, to some extent, you can look at Francis Ngannou as like one of the most unlucky fighters to ever exist. I mean, this is a guy who, for the longest time, when he was in the UFC, he was being underpaid. Even as a champion, he was making, I think his biggest payday was when he fought Cyril Gane. He made 600k. Now, you can see on the graphic there, his pay packet was compared to Ariana Celeste. Ariana Celeste, for those that don't know, is like a MMA, like UFC ring card girl, and in her like yearly salary, I think she made 1 million. While Francis Ngannou, who's the heavyweight champion of the UFC, only made 600k. Now, obviously, there's a few caveats to that. Obviously, Ariana Celeste, she didn't just do one show. She does multiple shows. She probably does, let's just be honest about it, like an OnlyFans page. She probably has multiple streams of income. So for her to make £1 million while Francis Ngannou only made 600k, it's not like it's just based on one show. It's based on like almost like a year of working, while Francis Ngannou technically only worked for like 30 minutes when he fought Cyril Gane. But when you have to look at it is, right, if you compare that, right, like Francis Ngannou making 600k, from a relative perspective, most people who have working class jobs, 9 to 5s, they might say 600k sounds like a lot of money. It does. It is, relatively speaking, a lot of money, right? 600k. Most people, like 99.9% of people, are never going to make 600k in a year, right? But what you need to understand is, as a fighter, you're not an employee. You're a fighter. So the fact is, you making 600k, you're seen almost like a company. So when you make 600k as a fighter, first of all, that gets halved. So you're left with 300k. The reason why it gets halved is because of income tax in the US. So 50% of that money's gone before you even get it. So 300k is gone. So you're left with literally 300k, okay? Then on top of that, you've got training expenses. Now with MMA fighters notoriously have got higher training expenses than boxers. Now the reason for that is because MMA fighters, because they train in multiple disciplines, they have to hire multiple coaches. Not only does the average MMA fighter have a kickboxing coach, they also have a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach, they also have a wrestling coach, and then also they've got a strength and conditioning coach, right? On top of that, you've got other expenses that comes with being an MMA fighter. So for example, you might have to pay for training expenses, you might have to pay for sparring partners, you might have to pay for promo work and all of this other stuff that you do on the side that just helps you, right? So with all of these expenses, obviously travel expenses, traveling to and from the destination, it might sound like a minor expense, but if you think about it, Francis Ngannou is even though he's based in Las Vegas, he's probably from Cameroon, so he probably goes back and forth a lot. So with all of these expenses put into place, let's just be conservative and say you take away 100k for expenses, okay? So what is Francis Ngannou left with? Even though he started with 600k, which sounds like a lot of money, he's actually left with 200k. So a fighter of his caliber, who's the UFC heavyweight champion of the world and is seen as the baddest man on the planet, he's walking away with 200k. Now, obviously, I mentioned Ariana Celeste. Ariana Celeste is obviously an employee of the UFC. I guarantee she does not have the level of expenses that Francis Ngannou does. Now, even though she made 1 million and she probably got taxed, so she probably left with 500k. Let's just be conservative and say she had like 100k of expenses, right? Like, she's still walking away with 400k. Well, Francis Ngannou, he fought once and he's only left with 200k, and this is the heavyweight champion of the world. So let's just be honest about it. The UFC have underpaid Francis Ngannou significantly, okay? So now, after a long time period of fighting out of his contract with the UFC and negotiating and trying to get a better contract, he eventually decides to walk away from the UFC, which is what he does, and he decides to go into boxing. So for his entire tenure in the UFC, he was being underpaid and underappreciated, not getting paid what he's worth, only getting paid a little bit here and there. Let's play devil's advocate. Let's say the UFC did do a few things that are pro-fighter. For example, if you get injured in a fight, right? If you get injured in a fight, then what happens is the UFC actually covers your medical expenses, okay? So let's say, for example, you get a cut in a fight, you get some type of injury, you break a bone, you break a leg, you break something, your elbow snaps, something happens to you when you're fighting. Like you get put into an arm bar and you refuse to tap, and your arm gets snapped off. Something happens. That's a fatality in the sport. The UFC, any injury you get in the sport, right, in the actual octagon, the UFC will pay for that. All expenses spared. So any injury any fighter gets, the medical insurance plan that the UFC has does pay for that. So let's be fair to the UFC. Let's give it some credit. Another thing that they've got something called a PI, which is the Performance Institute. Now we do know that Francis Ngannou for the longest time did have injuries. The PI, the Performance Institute, is this world-class facility which has, it's got a massive training room with all bags. It's got strength and conditioning coaches. It's got everything, right? If you're part of the UFC, right, you don't have to pay any expenses when you train there. Okay, it's absolutely free. If you're a UFC fighter, you can literally train there for free. And not only that, you get world class sparring because everyone that trains there is a UFC fighter. And not only that, you've got dietitians there. You've got literally a strength and conditioning team. You've got like a nurse. You've got a hospital that's attached to it. So any injuries or niggles that you have, you can go there and you can get it sorted free of charge. Okay, this is what I've heard. Okay, so let's be real. Francis Ngannou for the longest time had these two knee injuries, right? And to some extent you can say that he's screwed over the UFC, because as he's negotiating with the UFC, he's still technically with them. So what he was doing is he was negotiating with them for a very long time, yeah, trying to go on 100 dinners. But while he was doing that, he was getting his injuries healed by the Performance Institute, all expenses spared. He doesn't have to pay for anything here, and the UFC literally healed him up here. And he didn't have to pay for a single thing. Anyone that knows about America knows any injury that you get, any illness that you get, the medical system in America is quite exploitative, and it literally, if you break a leg or something, you'd have to pay money to the ambulance for getting you there and back. You'd have to pay money for your hospital stay. It's not uncommon for many people to become bankrupt after they have a stay in the hospital in the US. So Francis Ngannou, he obviously took advantage of that situation, and he went to the Performance Institute and he got himself healed up, and he didn't have to pay a single dime for that. I'm not all like pro fighter in the sense that I am pro fighter, but like you gotta give credit where it's due as well. Like the UFC does do a few things that is pro fighter. And let's be real, there's probably many times he got bonuses as well. When Francis Ngannou knocked out Stipe, became the heavyweight champion of the world, there's no denying it, he probably would have got a bonus for the knockout of the night when he knocked out Stipe. So there's many times when the UFC does go out their way to pay the fighters. Like he would get 50k as a bonus on top of his fight purse just for knocking out Stipe. But overall, I think it's fair to say for him to walk away with 200k as the heavyweight champion of the world, right? For in the UFC, who's seen as the baddest man on the planet, he's getting underpaid. Like he's not getting paid what he's worth. Okay, so Francis Ngannou, after this situation with the UFC, has walked away. Then he goes into boxing, okay, and finally he's getting paid what he's worth. Okay, he's getting 10 million for one fight. 10 million for one fight, okay? So let's just say hypothetically that gets halved, okay? So he walks away with 5 million. Let's say his training expenses is less now because he's only training in boxing and strength and conditioning. So instead of paying 100k in training expenses, he pays 50k in training expenses, right? So he's walking away with 4.5 million. No, not 4.5 million. About 4.950k. About he's getting close to 5 million in one fight. So in one fight in boxing against Tyson Fury, he's walking away with more than all of his career, his purses in the UFC career combined. He's made more money in one fight in boxing than he's made in his entire UFC career. Because his biggest payday in the UFC was when he fought Cyril Gane, and he got 600k, as you can see on the graphic there, right? So his other paydays in the UFC, he's probably making 500k, sometimes making 300k. Like many times he said that he was struggling financially fighting for the UFC so much that he had to borrow money off friends, because this is a guy that takes care of a lot of people from Cameroon, so it's not just himself that he's worrying about. So finally he gets paid that mega payday in boxing, but guess what? Not only does he get paid that mega payday in boxing, he gets robbed. He gets robbed horribly. I mean, let's be real, most people thought he won that fight. If that decision went to Francis Ngannou, I don't think anybody would have complained. Nobody would have said, oh, that was a robbery. many people from just the physical standpoint of watching that fight thought that Francis Ngannou not won that fight. He knocked down Fury, he made him look stupid in there, and he completely dominated him and outboxed him. Not only did he knock him down, it's not like the rest of the fight he got outboxed. All Fury ever did in that fight was throw more jabs than him. But apart from that, I think it's fair to say that Francis Ngannou completely outboxed him and knocked him down as well. Decimated him and he embarrassed him, and the fact that Tyson Fury won that fight by a single point to a guy who's a boxing debutant who's never fought professionally, amateur, in white collar. Francis Ngannou's got no professional boxing experience at all. For him to do that to Tyson Fury is incredibly embarrassing. Okay, but guess what? He doesn't get the decision. So this is a guy who, in his entire career in the UFC, has been underpaid. He's not been paid what he's worth. When he finally does get paid big money, he gets robbed in boxing. So he leaves the UFC because he's getting underpaid and he thinks it's corrupt that he's not getting the money that he's owed. But then he goes into boxing and he finally gets the money that he's worth, right? And guess what happens? He gets robbed. He gets robbed horribly on the cards. He doesn't get the win that he's sorely deserves. And not only that, the Tyson Fury did not put the title on the line, so even if he got the win, he wouldn't have become champion. So the cards were decked against him from the beginning. And let's be real, it's all because of politics. The Saudis have put so much money into the Tyson Fury versus Usyk fight. They weren't going to jeopardize it by having Francis Ngannou beat their man Tyson Fury. So let's just be honest about this. From the beginning, he's been underpaid his whole career in the UFC, and then when he finally gets into boxing where he's making big money, and it took a long contract dispute with the UFC to get to this point. It took years and years and years of negotiation, pain, hassle, lawsuits, all of this stuff that he had to go through. He finally gets his fight in boxing. He gets the win. In my opinion, a lot of people thought he won, myself included, and he doesn't get the win because he gets robbed, but he gets the payday. It's just ironic, right? He goes from one institution, one organization that was horribly underpaying him, and then he goes into another institution, which is boxing, and he gets robbed horribly on the cards. But despite all of this, okay, I think it's undeniable to say Francis Ngannou has won in life. I mean, this guy, where he came from, he started fighting at the age of 26, right? 11 years later, at the age of 37, he's got this massive payday in boxing, and he's now become a global megastar. Like, everyone knows about Francis Ngannou now. From boxing to MMA, he's probably one of the biggest combat sports stars in the world. Obviously, he's not on the level of a Conor McGregor. He's not on the level of a Floyd Mayweather or anyone like that. But let's be real, after that fight with Tyson Fury, I think a megastar was born. So many people that were boxing fans who've never seen Francis Ngannou fight in the UFC were massive fans after that fight. Okay, and now he's going to get mega paydays in boxing, okay? Whoever he fights next, if he fights AJ next, that's a 20 million fight, 20 million pound fight. If he fights Tyson Fury next, that's a 30 million pound fight. And this guy literally has won in life. He became a UFC heavyweight champion, right? And he never lost his title in the ring, in the octagon. Then he goes into another sport and he beats, in my opinion, beats the heavyweight champion of the world, but never gets the title. So you got a lineal champion in two different sports, and his name is called Francis Ngannou. I think he's the baddest man on the planet. He goes into Tyson Fury's own sport, and people always speculate what would happen in a street fight between Tyson Fury and Francis Ngannou. Well, Tyson Fury can barely beat Francis Ngannou in his own sport. He can't even beat him in boxing. We saw what happened that day. We saw him get humiliated. We saw him get violated, decimated. We saw the way he got absolutely destroyed in front of the world's media, in front of the biggest sports stars in the world, like Cristiano Ronaldo and other like the Saudi royals that were all ringside that watched that fight, in front of people like the Undertaker. We saw him get absolutely humiliated in front of the likes of Mike Tyson. We saw what happened that night, and we all know Francis Ngannou won that fight. So I think it's fair to say, despite everything he's been through, despite the fact that he's underpaid in the UFC, despite the fact that he was robbed in boxing, Francis Ngannou's just won in life. He's won the lottery. He's literally won the lottery, because in his next fight, he's going to make easy 20 million. And let's be real, let's talk about the PFL deal. The PFL deal gives him the flexibility to make all these big paydays in boxing, but he could go back to UFC whenever, he could go back to MMA whenever he wants in that organization, and he's guaranteed another 8-figure payday. And not only that, he's become a representative for fighters in MMA. He's going to become an African representative for his own country. And on top of that, let's be real about it, this guy's made all of this he's made all of this money, and let's be real, if he stayed with the UFC and he decided to go for that £8 million payday against John Jones, let's be honest about it. John Jones is out right now with a tricep injury, not a tricep injury, a pectoral injury. So let's be real, Francis Ngannou made the right decision to leave the UFC, as John Jones is literally out with a pec injury, and Francis Ngannou would have been on the sideline for another year or two, and he would not have got this massive payday if he didn't fight Tyson Fury. So I think Francis Ngannou has won in life. He's literally won in life. I mean, if you look at where this guy came from, homeless in France, I mean, crossing the Sahara Desert, I mean, growing up in the sand mines of Cameroon, this guy made it against all the odds, and he's won in life. So I just wanted to document this and just let it be known about what we witnessed last weekend when Francis Ngannou completely destroyed Tyson Fury. Tell me what you think below about what I just said. Do you think what I said is correct? Do you think what I'm saying is not true? Tell me what you think, and like and subscribe to the channel. I've got a lot more content coming your way. Peace.